Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of a double bill. Today, we had Stuart Lloyd on this morning giving us a fact and myth show about the Death Railway in Burma and time. But now we have essentially a crossover show. Burden of Command is a new RPG set in Italy and Germany and other areas of World War II. Luke Hughes is here to talk about the creation of the game. And John McManus, regular appearer, is that a word? It is now, on the channel, is here to talk about the 7th Infantry Regiment and how his book inspired the gameplay. So I'll bring the chaps in now. Hi, Luke. Hi, John. How are you both today?
Happy to be here.
Good. So we've just been kind of getting the ball rolling in the pre-game chat there. Balancing history and video gaming is obviously the big thing we're going to be talking about. But before we do that, Luke, let's begin with the concept of, for those who don't know, just briefly tell us what an RPG is and how Burden of Command is different and how you got in touch with John.
Yeah, thanks. So context for me, since I'm talking to a history crowd, is my dad was a professional historian and my mother and father both served in World War II. So it's pretty personal for me. Dad did history of technology, Thomas Park Hughes. There, I've plugged my deceased dad, but he deserves a plug. Anyway, what's an RPG? Role-playing game. So origin is like D&D, right? But it's morphed into 6,000 directions. There are science fiction ones, there are fantasy ones, but there are also history ones out there. And there are digital ones, and there are tabletop ones. And so ours is a leadership RPG. What the hell does that mean? I would think Forbes called it interactive band of brothers. So, and if I were to narrow it a little bit, I'd say leadership RPG. In other words, in a nutshell, think of yourself, what if you were Captain Winter from Band of Brothers? How would you handle those decisions? And those decisions were real ones. And so our goal is to not only put you in that position, but to engage you in the real history, to connect you to the winners of the past and what they experienced. And in particular to John's book, who chronicles the cotton balers who were, well, I should let John introduce cotton balers, but the short version is we follow an historical regimen. We put you in situations they had to handle, plus some that we know happened in other contexts. But you should feel that when you play our leadership role-playing game, you are engaging and connecting to some actual history, inadequately, but more than is typical.
Well, thank you, Luke. And John, well, Luke teed you up there. Your book brought sort of some recognition and fame to this regiment, and you've come on the channel and talked about them, and they are a very good representation throughout their service of a good, solid infantry regiment that learn how to do the job, have great examples of leadership, and finding that moral fiber and all those things here. So there is a group of historians who, when they hear about graphic novels, video games, even TV shows, just kind of roll their eyes and say, well, it's not serious. This isn't your first foray into the gaming world, is it, John?
No, I mean, actually, it's interesting because I got my mind open to games, many years ago, because one of the things I noticed in the classroom is a lot of my students had gotten very interested in history, and in particular military history, and in particular American combat military history through games. And it wasn't the kind of thing where they were just stopping there. It was almost like a gateway drug in that they kind of wanted to know more. They wanted to know the context. They wanted to know whether such and such was accurate. And so I had that base point. And then, of course, in this context, Luke contacted me, many years ago when he had this idea, saying, I was very inspired by your book about the 7th Infantry, and I think we can make this into an excellent role-playing game. And what I like about Burden of Command is it's very faithful to the history, because I totally get where a lot of my fellow historians are coming from, because there is schlock out there. And I have to say, too, I'm not a big fan of first-person shooter games and that kind of thing. I think it kind of desensitizes us to violence, and I don't know that it's really all that historically accurate when you come down to it on some levels. So this isn't that. And I was so Luke was very clear about that from the start. He wanted a kind of decision-based, emotion-based, personality, relationship-based game. And that's exactly what I tried to convey in the book about the 7th Infantry Regiment, American Courage, American Carnage, and then the other volume about them too, is these were people. Why do they do what they do? What kind of dilemmas do they have? All that amazing stuff that I think continues to draw us as historians.
And that's a good answer, because as we'll play the trailer in a minute, is that everybody playing a video game or a board game can be involved in the process of making decisions. Now, when we study World War II, we can't be involved in the process of, I don't know, designing P-47 Thunderbolts or really understanding, for example, you know, how a Sherman tank works. But that basic soldierly role of having to make a decision, do I go left across that field or do I go right across that field? Is now the time to stop and, you know, restock, or is now the time to press on and take advantage? That is something that I guess we can all identify with on some level with our lives. And I guess connecting that with World War II gaming is what we're after. And just a representative comment from History Underground, who we were just talking about you, JD, a few minutes ago. He is saying it's remarkable to see the depth of knowledge that my students enter the classroom with simply due to video. So there's someone who is working at the coalface, teaching college-age people, and they're coming with their information, some of it, or a lot of it, a percentage of it, from video games. But let's play the trailer, and then I'll ask you to come and comment on it, because we will have people who are in the sidebar who are very familiar with what games are, and people for whom this is very new. So let's fire the trailer up, and then we'll come back to the conversation. Here we go, folks. Oops, hang on. Hang on.
Nope, the wrong one.
That's the wrong one. I did the wrong thing. Hang on. There we go.
You can tell it's live.
Tell it's live. That's me screwing things up.
That's the charm of it.
Can you pause it, please?
I can.
Perfect timing. So here's a perfect example to make the connection. So I hope you thought, oh yeah, but expose yourself. The context in the game is expose yourself to a sniper because they can't spot the sniper. Now this sounds like stupid Hollywood. Who would do that? Cue John. Some real history, please, John.
Absolutely, because this is based on something that really happened. Lieutenant Colonel John Heinkus was a battalion commander in the 7th Infantry Regiment, which, by the way, is part of the 3rd ID in World War II. And in World War I, it is now. It has been mostly in between, although not always. So, you know, you have a situation at that point in the summer 1943 in Sicily for the 7th Infantry Regiment, and their nickname is the Cotton Balers, where the population is generally very welcoming. They're tired of the Germans. They're tired of the war. And, of course, there's a lot of Italian Americans, a lot of ties between Sicily and the U.S. But certainly there's still some people going to resist. There's hardcore fascists. There's Italian army. There's Germans, whatever. And so you have a situation in which in this town, you got a sniper out there, you know, who's wreaking some level of havoc. And Heinkus being a very courageous and kind of lead from the front, a very youthful commander at that point. And by the way, Heinkus, fascinating stuff. He was actually had a German background and emigrated to America. He eventually, you know, becomes a 3-star general later in life. But in this moment, he's a young battalion commander, decides I'm going to lead from the front. So there's a decision he makes, and he decides to basically turn himself into a decoy and see if the sniper will shoot at him as a way to figure out where this sniper was. You know, so fortunately he survived. But it could have turned out differently. And so will it for you as you make this decision? Exactly. Who knows? I mean, that's the neat thing about this, I think.
Wow. And we hope you don't reload, because you won't feel the burden if you just reload, right? That's called save scumming for the gamers, right? They can, oh, I didn't like that. Let me just try again. But we strongly encourage people. We had one YouTuber say, you know, I really wanted to save scum, but I took the advice and I didn't. And now I'm really connected. And then the line that made me really happy is he said, now I feel like every great move is my genius and every terrible move is my idiocy. But he owns it, right?
Like real
life. One of the things I've often said on tours is that, you know, as I use an analogy saying there is no second go in real life. If you make a mistake, you cannot go back to the start menu and try again. And I wonder how you deal with the fact, was there a game where you literally kind of were closed out of the game if you didn't complete it and people complained because they weren't getting their money's worth? I feel I read that 4 or 5 years ago.
Most games will tend to, if you don't complete the mission, they will punish you, meaning you failed, right? For instance, our game, if you might win the mission but lose with the men, which is another victory condition because you caused too many casualties. You might decide to fail the mission and win with the men, with the sergeant because you're going to preserve lives, as real commanders did. Early on, the many vets in the project taught me never say retreat. You choose to withdraw. But my point is, most games you must complete or you get kicked out. In this game, you will not be kicked out. You might die, in which case a new commander might come in. And just a spoiler alert, one of the more interesting things that happens is you come in as a replacement. You hear about what your reports thought about you when you were in your previous incarnation. So we encourage people not to reload, because we want you to go through the full experience and your company to go through the full experience, like the soldiers had to.
Yeah, brilliant. Let's go back to the trailer and we'll carry on the conversation.
Yep. You can stop it here.
Yeah. So, whoops, hang on. So I want to speak to you, John, and then bring Luke back in again about, we know from writing history, talking about history, that winning and losing is very binary. And we know veterans who have survived World War II, who came back having been on the victorious side. They survived, but they were still effectively beaten by the experience. They did not deal with life afterwards. And we did the talk about the death railway this morning, men who came back from that and had survivor's guilt. So, John, when you're having your discussions with Luke, how do you kind of attempt to bring some of that complexity in? Because, my old kind of Space Invaders, I'm that old, folks, you die or you win. It's very, very binary. But as we know from World War II, that those kind of binary reactions are not really what's like. So what kind of advice did you give to Luke and his team?
100%. I mean, it's so true, and especially in this case with the 7th Infantry, a unit that fought from North Africa all the way to Berchtesgaden and everywhere in between. There's so much of that, so many layers of complexity, so many people destroyed physically or emotionally, mentally by the war. So I kind of drew from that experience of either having studied some of these folks or having known some of them, and actually quite a few of them, who they did have, as World War II veterans, always that sense of pride and a victory in bringing a better war or a better world, I guess, into existence. But, I don't know how much that meant at the moment. And Burden Command is all about being in the moment. In the moment, you're in this situation. What do you do? And, so I think what I really like about it is there's seldom an easy decision one way or the other. And that's one of the things that really struck me as I, studied the regiment's history and wrote about it. I was like, wow, it's dilemma after dilemma after dilemma. Yes. What do they do? How could it have turned out differently? We don't always like to get into hypotheticals. And so my advice to Luke was to try and replicate that somehow. And of course, being a historian, my agenda is always to have it reflect what really happened as much as possible and to be accurate and all that. So that was always kind of my obnoxious agenda, for him. But what was great is that he respected that. Obviously, he's the son of a professional historian and is just wired in a way to respect the actual history. Anyway, that's what this is for, so that we can maybe have a little more empathy and understanding of who they were and what they did.
May I add to what John said there?
Yeah, please.
So, I was a director of research for a while for Accenture, so research is very important to me. So, I read a lot on these areas, and also I did some research on the issue we're bringing up, like how the war stays with them. So I claim no expertise, but I do claim some reading on it. So we all have heard of PTSD. That typically refers to the off the battlefield response, right? You hear the car backfire and you hit the ground. But there are other variations of that. So one is called, let me see if I get my terms right, combat stress reaction, which is kind of like PTSD in a battlefield. So in Band of Brothers, you see the guy who goes blind. He's not physically blind. He's psychologically blind. That's not too uncommon as a manifestation early in combat. That's combat stress reaction. But over time, the background thing, because you said, how are they later? John did, is combat fatigue, which another technical term, but it means basically psychological wear and tear. So over time, you accumulate psychic damage, to put it fancy, and that manifests in the following way. So early on, you do the combat stress reaction. You're freaked out first time in combat. And I'm basing all this on a particular article in 1946 where they interviewed tons of vets, and they describe the pattern I'm about to tell you. So I'm not saying this, I'm relaying it to you. So first exposure to combat, strange shock responses, crying, uncontrollable trembling, running, etc. Not everybody, just variations of behavior. Then people start to show they're vets. They can handle the stress. They react well. They fight well. They're effective. But what's so interesting is behind the scenes, the evidence is they're still accumulating the combat fatigue. They're just not manifesting it, right? And then, you probably heard this, right? Everybody breaks eventually. So the evidence is eventually, I think it's something like 400 days of combat or less. I forget the statistics. Maybe John knows. But you start to manifest again, right? So it has been building up in you. And so you start to show all the stuff you showed early on. And a classic one would be strange behavior, because now you realize that you start saying things like, well, there's a bullet out there for me. And then maybe you sit there on the battlefield upright. And they say, what the hell are you doing? Joe? He says, what's the point? I'm going to be gotten anyway. I might as well get this hell over. So in the game, we model that, meaning we accumulate for you combat fatigue in your men. And over time, your reports, the characters you get to know, your lieutenants will start manifesting it, all the things I talked about there. And also the squads, if they've had too much of it, will start to freak out. So what we can do is we can only point at and convey a sense experience like a book can, or like a tour. We can't give you the experience. Probably, thank God, we can't give you the experience. But we have quite a few vets on, including combat vets. And one of the reasons they got involved, because they want this gotten across. They want to get across that, it's not cool out there. It's not a power trip like many games do. It's a burden of command. And I'll say one last thing, I'll shut up. So a book that influenced me early on, Carl Melentes, Vietnam War writer and vet. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and he resigned to become a lieutenant in Vietnam. How many people would take that choice? And he went to Vietnam. He was lieutenant. He wrote about it in a wonderful book called What It's Like to Go to War. And he said something I think is brilliant and to the point of burden. Also, he said, war is spiritual. Now, before we bridle by what the hell he meant by that, what he meant was death. How can anything be less spiritual than being in the presence of death? And I didn't say good spiritual, might be hellish. On the other hand, it might be Band of Brothers at times, brotherly love, heroic sacrifice for others. But he said, you're entering the temple of Mars. So our first part where you go into fighting in Morocco, Operation Torch, the writers and we labeled it the Temple of Mars. And we're trying to put you through that introductory process to the burden of command.
Yeah, little real world anecdote from 7th Infantry history about exactly what Luke was just saying. This accumulation over time. What's interesting to me is it usually doesn't, when someone reaches the end, it didn't seem to manifest in a big dramatic meltdown of some kind, whimpering and crying or whatever. But it's more like you just said, an incredible kind of fate, tempt fate or fatalism is the word I'm searching. And less effective, sloppier, more fatigued or whatever. So, but also looking for a socially acceptable way out. And the anecdote I wanted to share was a young rifleman who had fought at Anzio, and he had fought in the invasion of South France. And by the standards of mega heroes or whatever, I think he would fall short. He wasn't in combat for 300 days or whatever. It was probably more like 30 or 35 days. but he's a normal guy and he's very young, and he was really approaching the end of his tether. And he got wounded and he was in the hospital, and he worried very much that they were going to send him back. We like to think of the tales of guys leaving the hospital so they can be with their buddies, and certainly that happened. I wouldn't say otherwise. But in this case, I think a lot of us can relate to this, because this guy was like, I don't know how I can go back. I don't know whether I can. Yet I don't want to be scorned. And he had seen, by the way, in that same hospital, a soldier who had a self-inflicted wound, and he was separated from the others, and he had an SIW in front of his bed, of sign saying that. And so this guy, like, the greatest moment of his life was when the doctor came to him and examined his wound, and was giving the prognosis, and he said to him, "Son, I think you're done with the front line. I don't think you can do it anymore." And he meant physically. And this guy was thinking internally, emotionally, I can't either. And so to me, that is the exact microcosm for this whole scenario that we see play out in Burden of Command and in real life in the book I wrote.
Wow. And History Explorer, who's serving in the British Army, been on our channel before, he says, as our regimental medical officer says, everybody has a stress bucket, and some buckets fill quicker than others, but everyone's bucket will eventually fill regardless of how many holes you put in it. And that's a very good way of explaining that. And so, Luke, I want to ask you how you kind of put that into gameplay that people wouldn't get as a gamer frustrated with, because I'm not really a gamer, but if I was playing, I don't know, like a flight simulator game, I would assume that the more skillful I get at it, the better I would accomplish and move on in the game. But you have to somehow bring in this element of luck, because as John knows, as the writer of this stuff, is
random death.
It's the guy who's got all the qualities, who seems to be making the right decisions, is the guy who maybe crumbles on the wrong day, and the other guy who's been sort of maybe not always making the right decisions, sort of learns by osmosis and ends up surviving the war and becoming a very recognized, leader of men. How do you kind of put in that randomness that is, think of the scenario, I don't know, a guy gets squad across the field, and then a friendly fire stonk just wipes his men out. It wasn't his plan, it wasn't a decision he made, it was one of those random acts. How do you put that stuff in?
Well, kudos, Paul. I've never been asked that question, strangely enough. It's a really good question, because of course war is plenty of random death, which has no justice to it. So a YouTuber was just playing the game recently, and a historical gamer, and he wrote me later, and he said, I almost quit the game, and I didn't quit the game because I was doing a live stream like we're doing right now, so I couldn't. Now he's still playing the game and he's still enjoying it, but why did he want to quit the game? He said he was in I think he was in the deserts in Morocco, and out of the blue, just shut down across the map. Now as a gamer, that's frustrating. It's not fair. Right? You didn't do anything terribly wrong, though I'd have to go check the footage. Maybe he was running around the open, which is rather dangerous move. But let's say he wasn't. It can happen. We make it more rare than real combat. It's something like 30% casualty rate for junior officers. It's brutal. But we do a little less because we want you to bond with the men, and we're not going to make you spend 70 hours eating meals with them and, shooting the crap. So we delay the casualty rate. But back to the point. Very frustrated. But he recovers, and the officer didn't die, but he wasn't sure at the time. So for gamers, this is hard, because they've been taught, power trip. If I do what do gamers want? Like all humans, they want, if they do the right thing, they get rewarded. But sometimes, as you just said, you might do all the right things, and you still might suffer. I'll give you one more example. When we're doing our play testing, this is an interesting one. So very educational for us as the designers. So you have some tanks in one of the scenarios, Shermans, and you send them down the road. All the playtesters would do that. And a lot of our playtesters are not anybody who plays war games or anything like that. They're just people very interested in the idea of this. They might play role-playing games or just interested in the immersion. So they send their tank down the road, and it gets blown up in a mine. They had no control of it. An event pops, your Sherman's blown up. We got a lot of complaints from the playtesters, like, what the hell? That's totally unfair. And they're right. It's totally unfair. But of course, the Germans had zero interest in being unfair. Now being fair. Now as a game, though, we have to make an engaging experience. We will lose people. It's just constant like, oh, it sucks and you have no control. So how do we handle that? So one of the tricks we use is we teach after the moment. So the tank gets blown up. Then not by chance, Sergeant Grant, was actually voiced by one of the Band of Brothers actors, Shane Taylor. So we're very privileged about that. Comes over and he says, "Hey, that sucks, Captain." I'm paraphrasing here. Totally unfair. But I guess, that's what the Germans do. They know we're going to go down the road. So I guess we'll have to avoid going down it. And now it's a teaching moment. And people are very willing to learn at that moment because they just took a loss. And I just saw a historical gamer this morning playing, and very interesting. He was cursing at the screen in a way that made me happy, which was, "Damn it, I just got that squad destroyed. Damn it, I just got them wrecked." And the implication was he felt it was his fault. Now there it's agency, right? He said, and then what made me really happy, he said, "I've got to remember not to move troops in front of the enemy without suppressing them." So he took a teaching moment. So when there's random arbitrary, there's just some and it just is. But some of it we can teach around and then they learn. And then I'll put one last way. So Paul, if you were playing, you'd have to make the following decision. Do I lead from the front? And this is a game decision. With the men, do I put my little leader on the map with them? This is great to do. You'll keep their morale up. You'll keep them going to the assault. You'll direct their fire well. But, gee, I wonder what might happen if you keep putting your leader in the front lines. Alternatively, keep them back. Not a bad decision. People may remember in Band of Brothers, Winters is champing at the bit to get out on the field where the lieutenant's screwing up and then he's being taught. You got to stay back sometimes at the higher levels. So maybe you stay back. You can keep command and control of your units in Burden. But if you're up front, not forget dying, you might get suppressed. And then you can't order people because you're keeping your head down. But if you're in the back, great. You got command and control. But do you think the men aren't noticing that you're not putting your ass on the line? They're noticing. And so in the game, you don't gain trust because you're keeping yourself safe while they die. So those are those dynamics. And our goal, like I think John said earlier, is to always give you, my goal as a game designer is to put you in situations where you have no easy choice and you're not, and any choice has pros and cons. And now you have to decide who the hell you are, because you don't get, oh, that's the winning move. There's no winning move, to some extent.
And this is where you're selling me the notion, Luke, because I'm not a gamer really. I've dabbled, but I don't have the time, and I feel I'd end up getting addicted. But as John knows, who's a good writer, is you want obviously your reader to connect with the story.
Yes.
But at no point in reading John's book do you feel like it's you, the reader, making the decision. You're understanding what the person you're reading about did and the implications for that person. But there's always that distance of time and the fact that the event has already played out. So if you stop and put a bookmarker in the book, the situation won't change. Whereas I suppose the real-time effect of a game is that it is that moment of you making the decision. I feel that is where this can really make inroads, because we had the question from regular viewer Gary August. He says, maybe controversial, but what are the cost implications to play and learn in comparison to reading autobiographies on leadership? I'm not a gamer, just interested in education from another form. But I think that's what we're coming to, John. It's not that this is replacing or the traditional means of reading a book. It's another avenue of education. Is that how you see it, John?
Oh, absolutely. Which is that's always what interests me, is another manner of education. And I mean, like JD said it very well earlier, he's amazed at the depth of knowledge of a lot of the students who come to his, into his classroom based on the video games they've played. And, and of course, as I mentioned, I've seen the same thing. So I thought to myself, well, let's say Burden of Command is out there in the wild for everybody to play. Yeah. How much smarter then are people going to be about 7th Infantry Regiment history, which of course fires me up on a major level. I always want that. But also, just maybe a little bit larger empathy and understanding for those who are making the history, and the kind of weapons they manipulate and the kind of terrain they have, the scenarios. You learn maybe about the South France invasion, things that maybe you didn't know. A lot of us who study World War II, we kind of specialize in certain aspects of it or whatever. So when you're, on this journey with the 7th Infantry, you're really touring a lot of the European theater of war, because they're mixed up in it constantly, So I love that educational dimension of it. Yeah. And I really like that Luke had more or less the same vision, that this is an educational kind of thing, and he, respecting the history and the fact that hopefully you come away smarter from this game, but also maybe a little bit better human in a way of like, oh my gosh, there's these tough choices. What do I do? There's a humility I hope that comes out of that.
Good word. May I follow up on that?
Yeah, please.
So, I want the game to be successful, but it's very important to me what John said and you just said. I really care about connecting people to history. You know, it's personal for me with my father. It's personal for the vets, connecting to people in the present who are suffering. So this is not, oh, let's do something cool and fun. It matters to us. So as it does to the vets. And what I think so interesting in these conversations, I've had that, privilege like this one today is, look, what can John do that nobody else can do? He can tell you the truth. Well, I mean, there's limits, but truth of what happened, whereas the game can't, because people will make different decisions. It can tell some of it, but it's going to vary. Paul, when I think about you doing a tour, right, what you do is you put people physically, viscerally in connection with history. I remember being in Roman forums, and just blew my mind that I was about 10 feet away for Anthony gave his speech, in all probability. 10 feet away physically, just that connection. And so to each of our mediums, I think, has, and what we're doing right now is another way, right? Humans talking about something they care about, talking with the audience, is a way for us to connect. And I would say what games are different on, and their advantage of what you guys said, is empathy, but in a subtle way. There are certain emotions that cannot be experienced except in a game. What's an example? Guilt or remorse. So one of the writers put me in a situation I've never forgotten, and there are worse ones, which was, there's a farmhouse in the distance. There's German infantry in there. We're getting ready to call the artillery in. We're smart U.S. commanders. You're doing this in the game. But now the interactive fiction, because it gives you so much flexibility to do things not just on the tactical map, says, oh, there are civilians in the farmhouse with the German soldiers. Of course, we recognize this from Afghanistan and Iraq and modern situations. What are you going to do? Now you're in a burden of command situation, right? If you use artillery, you're killing civilians too, in all probability. On the other hand, if you go, you're bleeding heart in some sense, and you run across the field to save them with your men, you're killing your men who count on you to keep them alive within limits. So there's no right choice here. I think I used artillery in the end, but I've never forgotten it. I still feel guilt. Now, if you're reading the book or you're watching the movie or the TV series, you don't feel any guilt. Somebody else made that decision.
Yeah.
You make the decision. And that's a connection, right? You feel that. The last way I put it is, I look at the black and white photos. They used to be interesting. I love history. But now sometimes I look at it like from the game connection. My God, he was alive as much as I am. He was in his present. He was here in the way I am. And I'm going to be gone too, like all of us too. And so to have that connection to the past, to me, is fundamental in a deep sense.
Well, that brilliant response there, Luke, and John as well. And the next thing I want to ask both of you is, again, my vision of video games is levels getting progressively harder. At the Space Invaders, again, the ship goes faster and faster, the things come down again. But as we know from a regiment like the 7th, it's not like Morocco was level 1 and then moving into Germany in 45 was level 9, with each step getting progressively harder, because it's a non-linear curve. There are easier days at the office and then tough days, and sometimes the days in between the horrible combat are just as difficult for a commander as the days when you're in combat, because then you've got people tempted by, I don't know, booze and women and other things like that, and you've got to keep them motivated. So when you take, as you have done, you shared the history of the 7th through this sort of strange up and down roller coaster experience, then you've got to now put that into a game environment where you might have had I'm assuming you might have had a very, very terrible part, and then the next bit might be a little bit easier. Is that something you had to both of you wrestle with, the fact that an easier bit might come up at some point because that replicates history? And I'm talking relatively speaking. I'm not saying any days in World War II were easy, but you know what I mean.
I can reply that, but John, if you want to.
I mean, from my standpoint, absolutely. It's a constant up and down. It's almost just sort of randomized as to when's a good day, when's a bad day, where we have tough opposition, where we don't. We happen to be in reserve when there was a terrible battle, or vice versa. I mean, a million different variations of this. So yeah, I do like that about the game, that it's not like, oh, level this, that, and that, onto the level 10 or something, and now you're a master. So, you know, because that's not what actually happened. I mean, yes, you can get more proficient as you experience more war and know your craft, of course, but no, I mean, it just depends on the scenario. So you've got in Burden of Command, sometimes these kind of kinetic tactical scenarios in which your life and your people's lives are on the line, and you got other kind of social situations, dealing with civilians, like Luke just said, dealing with people who could be collaborators or not, dealing with POWs. How do you handle that? What's your philosophy? What kind of decisions do you make? So again, I really like this because it's kind of true to what these guys were actually experiencing. I think greater and true to life. I think really for anybody who proposes to be a leader at any level, it really doesn't even have to be military. You really got to be familiar with decision making, which I think for most of us in life is which alternative is less bad than the other.
Yeah.
That's what life is.
Life is the least shit. You're looking for the least shitty path as opposed to the best path.
Yes.
I mean, exactly.
Which of the paths ahead of me is less strewn with cowpats?
I mean, how many times are you confronted with, oh, here's some wonderful tasting ice cream, or here's some crap? Which one would you like? You know, life isn't like that. So, I mean, so I think anybody who can kind of immerse themselves into the Burden of Command world, and I think I would also suggest reading the real 7th Infantry history, you'd say to yourself, okay, well, what I learned from this that makes me a better decision maker or a leader, makes me understand people a little bit better, what makes them tick. I mean, all those kinds of things to me are what's most important beyond just knowing the little ins and outs of a tactical engagement at Lalande in South France or something. That's interesting and important, of course, but I think of the larger takeaway that it's applicable for anyone who reads the book or plays the game, maybe focuses on those larger concepts.
Yeah. I think that's what bring Luke in, is that there is no definitive way to be a good commander in World War II. I'm immediately thinking of, I don't know, Sobel, Winters, and Spears, if we're going to use the Band of Brothers references.
Yes.
They all had achievements within the style they adopted that offered the men under them different pathways through their career, but it's not easy to say one is better than the other. You know, that someone is thinking more about getting more men home and accomplishing the tactical victories slower. Other person is let's pull the band-aid off quickly, and the other one is let's tease it back and try and limit the pain. And I'm assuming, Luke, the both and an endless varieties of options are available to the player of Burden Command. It's not like you're asking your gamers to find this mythical perfect version. There is no mythical perfect version. It's how you do it. Am I right there?
Well, you made another important point, not just that, but that each person is different and each approach may be right for their approach.
Yes.
So I did a fair amount of management back in the day. One of the things I learned early was there's no general theory of leadership. Oh, if I just do this every time it'll work, because every person's different. There's a book, Battlefield Leadership or whatever. It's by, he taught at the Marine Academy. He was a German in World War I, and then he went on to become a Panzer Corps commander. And he gave a wonderful example. And then I'm going to take something from the game to answer your question. He said, I had 3 reports in World War I, and I learned each of them was different. I had to handle them differently. So one of my reports, he just wanted to be led by the nose. And I remember having some people, they really want to be told. They want to be told what to do next. It's less stressful to them. So he had to tell that. Another one, like deeply resentful if they were told what to do. I learned that I got so schooled by a capable reporter early on who pulled me in. Look, you gotta let me lead here, essentially, in a business context. So that was education. And then he did the third one, back to the World War I. He says, I knew that whatever I proposed, he would want to do the opposite. So I would always propose the one that I intended him to shoot down, so he would do what I wanted. Now, I'm going to give you a guy in the game. We give you mindsets. You can be zealous like Spears. You can be cautious. You can be compassionate, I think is one of them. You can be disciplinarian, professionalist, right? Winner's probably some marvelous mix. But I'm going to give you guys and the audience now an example we used when we were sort of framing the game, and this is from history. And I'm going to ask Paul. John will know by now, so he not allowed to cheat. And I'd like the audience to decide. And Paul, if you remember, I may have spoken to you once before, but if not, we'll do the audience. Okay. Lethal insubordination is this. Friendly artillery pummels the enemy. Suddenly your sergeant shouts the order to advance without so much as a glance your way, and definitely without your command. You bark the counter order. The men stumble to a halt. Your sergeant turns, bleary-eyed from drink or shock, and repeats his own command to the men. The barrel of the rifle shifts with a dreamlike slowness your way. Remember, this is an historical event. Choice: shoot him before he gets my men killed. You're going to lose your sergeant, obviously. Sergeant, now is not the time for an advance. Even chance of squad casualties. Sergeant, I am in command here. Might lose some trust. Chance of being shot. Knock the weapon from his grasp. Paul, you have 10 seconds. What are you doing? Probably should have 2 seconds to be fair.
Oh God, my immediate reaction is knock the weapon from his grasp. But
all right, congratulations on being a normal, typical human. I've asked this one, I don't know how many times now. I have never had the historical response chosen. This was Lieutenant Spears. He chose shoot him before he gets my men killed. And he shot the guy, I think, maybe he did. And he was absolved in a hearing because it was considered justified action. But nobody ever picks that normally because we're not in that situation. We're not Spears. And that's not to say the other choices couldn't have worked. But for Spears, it worked. And the military side, that was within bounds. And we know he was a very zealous.
That's an understatement. Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean,
at some point, maybe show one clip of some of these things. So people
which one do you want to play?
Well, I have sort of two goals. One is sort of the more obvious combat involved, and it might be fun to do the Rangers one, Cisterna, or we could do a more off the battlefield.
Let's do the Yan Zero advanced one, then we'll come back. I've made the decision. I made the executive decision. Let's do this one.
Look, leadership emerging right here, but I don't feel heard, Paul.
We're going to have Luke talking twice now because we have real Luke and we have pre-recorded Luke. So here we go, folks.
January 1944 in Italy, a theater not covered too much in games, and the cotton billers are actually trying to relieve a very large, maybe the first large-scale operation by the Rangers, who are a relatively new unit who have infiltrated behind German lines and captured a town called Cisterna, and we're going to open a corridor to them for the rest of the army to get to them. So I'm going to plunge in and be a player now. The Anzio advance. There's a glimmer of light in the east, throwing the hills into shadowy relief. You pass the word and stand your men to. In half an hour, it should be light enough to... A rip of automatic fire breaks the silence as an MG-42, that's a German machine gun, I do know that by now, having played, opens up near the distant town of Cisterna. Another machine gun joins in, then another. The pre-dawn haze resounds with the thump-thump of an enemy mortar, the bomb bursting before the town in a bright flash. The Rangers have found the Germans, and the Germans don't seem surprised. Well, that sounds slightly ominous. Mission: seize the objective. Men suffer no more than moderate casualties. All right, so now we're actually going to see the map for this mission, and we've planned for this. So the U.S. Army's laying down smoke for us. Those trenches you see up there is where we think the Germans are. Naturally, we don't really want to run across fields and get nailed, so we've asked for smoke, which you get decisions like this. You can control some smoke yourself, or you can get these pre-barrages. You can see the color of the land's a little different than you've been used to so far. It's muddy, which is a real constraint, meaning very hard to move off the roads, and for vehicles pretty much impossible. So that's just going to make this kind of a little World War I-like, and we see the trenches. But hopefully not too bad. We'll find out. Oh, let me show you the objective before I stop. We're heading all the way up here. Here's the objective. And where are we? Here we are. All right, that's it.
Nice by your audience. Rangers lead the way. Very good.
All right, we jumped ahead in time.
Who's
about 4
got a book
turns
coming
later,
out on Ranger escape missions in Italy very shortly. So that's Mia. He'll be a guest next month.
We're moving up towards their line. Yeah. There is some German resistance, but it doesn't look like a lot of it. And I am happy to say that we have some tanks on the side here, some Shermans helping us. So that's pretty nice. And with that, let's end the turn and see what's happening next. Oh. Uh-oh. Tigers in Cisterna. I'm not liking that title too much. The sun is up. Smoke rises from the town of Cisterna. The Rangers are fighting hard. Oh boy. You can just barely make out a shape that rumbles amid the clustered Cisterna buildings. There are tanks in the street. Wow. I sure hope that's just for flavor. It's not really tigers in the streets of Cisterna. Okay. Well, I'll leave it to our commentators. We'll press ahead.
So I just did something there.
All right. Well, it's about 2 turns later, and well, let's see what's going on. It's no good. Cisterna's a bust. Captain Boston says, "No captains, Ranger captain."
Can you pause it, Paul?
And we're hearing.
Yep.
So you see the little book icon there? That's John getting in the way of our game. What are you doing, John? We're trying to make it exciting here, and you're trying to have history happen. What the hell?
Can't have that.
So, I can't mouse over. This is pre-recorded, but those book icons are this insane idea of having footnotes in a game. But curiously enough, they're highly popular. Actually, I mean, I don't think everybody reads every one, but it tells people, they're connecting to some credible, the real things happen. So especially when the crazy stuff like, Hines stepping out in front of the sniper happens, footnote appears. So you can see it really did happen if you want to. And also, what did they decide as opposed to what you're deciding here? And I encourage you, Paul, John or Paul, interrupt anytime during this. This is just fodder for talk. We don't have to get
talking
anywhere.
over the radios you can see on the left. That's really depressing. Okay. In the background, you can hear the treads of a tank clanking past. We're having trouble disengaging, I imagine. The Huns are on us like a dockman's rash. Platoons are falling apart. We're going to try to slip away in small groups. Headed towards Balto. Over. Balto is the code word for south. Now remember, we're not making up a dramatic game situation. This is history. So things did get bad like this. Let's see what our options are. Option 1, candle 6. This is obviously a handle. We're barely holding our own here. Come to us. Or we have to meet in the middle. Or get out, Cord. That's, his name. We'll get in. So if we pick the first one, we're saying basically our situation's tough, which it could be, depending on how the play's going. We want them to come to us. But as you can see in the mouse over, they'll take casualties. On the other hand, if we do in the middle, they may take casualties. You're sort of balancing things. And we're risking some trust with the men because the men are like, in the last case, risk 10 trust. Get out, Cord. We'll get in. Right? In other words, we take all the risk. And so there's risk of trust. I'm assuming loss there. And that's a little ambiguous, but risk 5 trust. I see. Or we have to meet in the middle. We're risking some. In other words, let me get away from the details. The point is simple here, right? This is a classic burden of command. The core burden of command is men, their lives, versus mission. But that can get complicated. Variations of this are other men's lives, meaning other units, other friendly units. And are we going to risk the cotton balers and the men I've spent so much effort and time and suffering with to save these strangers, so to speak, the Rangers? Or, maybe let the Rangers pay a little higher price. So I'm going
to jump in there, Luke and John, because in fact, John, you were on the channel talking about Cisterna, and Mia, who's in the sidebar, was on the channel talking about Cisterna. You were doing the 3rd Infantry, 7th Regiment. He was doing the Rangers' point of view. Now, one of the key things about that whole, I'm not going to use the word debacle, but, that whole situation is the pressing of time, is the fact that decisions have to be made absolutely immediately, and everyone's like, you were going through those options there, Luke. Is there in the game, are you being penalized for not making a decision quickly? What happens if you sit there going, I don't know, I'll go and have an omelet, have a beer, and come back in a minute and make a decision? Because obviously in the moment you don't have any luxury of time to consider. So what happens in a situation like that? What speed do you how fast do you have to make that decision?
We don't mechanically put a timer on you, though I was very tempted to do it, and there are some games that try that, but if you're generally not doing it, it can be sort of like, what the hell, wait, I'm time. I think it'd be very effective. There are some games that just every decision generally, or a very high percentage, are timed. I'm not saying that wouldn't have been a good way to do it. But we do effectively the same thing. Like you'll make a choice here that uses up your time, right? So you made this choice, and so now you won't get the other choice, which we almost always never give you everything, right? And so there's the pressure of time, and you only have so many turns to achieve the objective, which of course means, well, I'm running out of time to get to the Rangers. I need to press harder, but if I press harder on the battlefield, I'll probably take more casualties because the Germans would love me to run out there without working over with artillery. So time is a heavy variable, but it's not literal in the game.
Right. Okay, and that reflects to a question we had from Cliff earlier about how do you reflect a leader getting tired after prolonged exposure to sleep deprivation, losses, food intake? Because again, with the real history, there are days when some days Lieutenant Smith goes out there having had a great big sleep and a big pile of spaghetti, and there's other days where he's been run ragged for 72 hours and barely caught. That seems to me another interesting dilemma. What's the solution in terms of the game?
Cliff, great question. Then I'll pass this to John. So John taught us early on, because I had repeated conversations with him and other people like Leo Murray, who's an expert on battlefield psychology. I recommend his book War Games. We were trying. I'm very interested. I have psychology and an emotional physiology background, neurophysiology background. How's the emotions in the battlefield work? And as the guy just asked, fatigue matters a lot. And John taught us that early on. He said, look, morale isn't just, oh, how brave are you feeling? How much have you pumped them up? Are you trained? It's a lot. Have you had, like you just said, Paul, a good meal or not? And so we have events in the game like the fiction's so powerful for opening up all this stuff. One of them is a very interesting one. You're in Vosges, I think, southern France, and it's cold and it's bitter. Thanks out of Battle of the Bulge. And should you stop to get the men hot food? But you're on a timetable, Paul, right? You got to get there. But the men, hot food would make a difference. They might even fight better. But then you're going to be later to the event. And I'll yield to John here to talk about these subtle forms of morale influence. In the game, what we'll do is we'll change your morale. We'll suppress the units who do or don't get food, etc. Or we'll say, you're starting this battle. Like, quick one, then again, John. Morocco, one of the problems, didn't get the supplies on the ground. So then they're moving towards Casablanca. This is from John's book. And so we model that by lack of supplies, not by, oh, there's a supply mechanic, because, we want to limit too many mechanics. We say everybody starts a little suppressed because they're not getting enough ammo, et cetera, and they're not fighting as well. John?
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. I mean, that's precisely what happened time and time again. You mentioned the Vosges, Luke. I mean, absolutely. The conditions at that stage of the fall of 1944, by the time the 7th Infantry Regiment is plunging deep into the Vosges, are really quite awful. It's a lot of heavy rain, a lot of mud, a brooding forest. You're not gaining much ground. The casualty rates are going up after the heady time in South France that you've had in August 1944. Which is no cakewalk, of course. I think we tend to maybe view it that way in relation to Normandy and some other tough fights. So I don't want to say it was easy, but compared to what you're up against in the Vosges now, if we're thinking about a battle earlier in the 7th Regiment's history, it's a little more analogous to Argonne Forest in 1918. And so, I mean, to my way of thinking, I mean, that is, the first time that the regiment had really plunged and fought into this kind of dense forest since 1918. So how do we deal with that? What kind of new morale issues are there? What does it mean for leaders? And leaders here today, gone tomorrow, too. I mean, that's the other side of it.
Yeah. Vertigan Forest makes me think of too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Let's just play the end of this one, and I'll come back with some questions.
Out there taking pain for a while. So what am I going to do here as a leader? And variations of this, by the way, are civilian lives. I remember a situation I was given where Germans hold up in a farm with civilians, and you can artillery save your lives, but risk the civilians, or you can go assault them without artillery, and then you're risking your men's lives versus civilians. And I think we all know this kind of situation has continued in Afghanistan, Iraq, name any current
Look, you made this point already.
Ukraine. So tough situations.
He wasn't watching.
And
sometimes you
can get in situations.
Tell them again, they'll just learn better.
You're going to get a lot of you're going to kill a lot of pretty helpless Germans. Is it worth it? There's a good argument it is worth it. I mean, they just can't defend themselves well at this point because you want the war to end. On our hand, is it becoming pointless slaughter at some point? So
sorry, that's a situation
burden
where
of command, lives versus mission, if I were going to abstract it. Here we have it in a nutshell from a real situation.
Brilliant stuff.
And captured a town
we have got
Cisterna, and we're going to open a corridor for the rest of the army to get to them. So I'm going to plunge in and be a player now.
There we go.
That's a German machine gun.
He's gone. So you mentioned the Germans there. Our past Luke talked about the Germans there. We had a question because I want to address some of the questions of viewers.
I'd like that.
how do you what metrics are you using for the opposing forces? Because that's the interesting thing. And I'm going back to my Space Invaders days and my ZX Spectrum Jet Set Willy, is that the enemy were just there to react to what I did. But as we know from history, of course, the enemy are facing all the same dilemmas as the heroes are playing. They have morale problems, they have supply issues, they're being kept awake by nighttime barrages. So you write a lot of your history, John, from the point of view of the Allies, with the Germans there commenting on the how did the two of you address the Germans and and not just the Germans? You say the civilian interactions. There's Italian troops, there's other troops, French troops, Vichy French troops. So how did you work out the metrics for the enemy?
Go ahead, Luke.
All right. Well, this is interesting. Okay, I want to return briefly on this question. Thank you, Gary, for this. I will argue with us a little bit earlier. We were saying, oh, it's not level 1, level 2, level 3. I read an excellent history book. I wish I can remember the title, but his argument is like the U.S. Army got incredibly lucky in that they didn't follow some of the arguments to land on the continent in 42, which I don't want to think about how that would have gone. But they landed in Morocco, and the Vichy didn't want to fight, mostly. Yeah. Like you guys said, there were exceptions, right? Italians. Late in the war, when you're landing there in Sicily, they don't want to fight anymore. Exceptions. But my point is, we model that, and then Germans are quite different. Germans are quite willing to fight. You experience that in the game in that the Vichy and the Italians manifest different tactics. So to repeat you, Paul, they tend towards a little passive and reactive, because actually I have a AI kind of psychology background. I model that in that the lower the morale, and this applies to your troops too, the less willing they are to do dangerous things. One of the frustrations for players in the game is green troops, and you order them to go get a bayonet stuck in their stomach. Strangely, they don't want to. You have to bolster them, and they still might not. Now, the Vichy are really not willing to die for the Germans, essentially, right? Or Vichy government. And the Italians are like, why are we doing this anymore? So what that means is they tend to stay passive. On the other hand, it tends to be a pretty horrible shock for the players when they encounter the Germans, as for the real Americans, late in the war, starting in Sicily. And the Germans, AI, depending on how the designers set them to defensive or offensive, will do things like, oh, you beat them up a little bit, so you move your units up close because you're going to whack them because, you've been doing it to the Vichy's and Italians. This is a bit of a spoiler, I realize. And the German unit and leader, literally in some sense, will sit there in the code and say, okay, they're near me. Are they suppressed sufficiently that I think I could win this assault? They're doing this like calculus, like you are, presumably. And if they're higher quality Germans and you're a little messed up, or you don't have a leader, or you don't look too good where you are, they will assault. And so then you discover that non-passive enemies will do to you what you did to them, especially if you play at what's called tactician level. We make them all higher quality. And guess what? They get more aggressive. We had some of our best players starting to struggle because the Germans would do aggressive things because the AI is sitting here and saying, oh, I feel pretty good. I'm a 4-star unit. He doesn't look that good. And look, he's a little suppressed and he's in the open and I've got terrain I can go through. I'm going to get this guy. And then it's unpleasant. So now what we don't do, I don't want to oversell this, Gary, is I would love to model sort of national differences more. We do a little bit in equality troops. We just ran out of cycles there. How tactics like, what the Germans tend to do, John, I'll yield the floor here, is, they became actually predictable in that when you took something from them, they would counterattack.
Counterattack. Pavlovian counterattack, as Jim Holland calls it.
Well said, right? So we do, the snare designers do try to, I should shut up. We do try to get some of the German qualities going. But, how do Russians fight? How do French fight? How do Americans fight? John, maybe you want to say
something. So I had 2 challenges in my research for this. Challenge number 1 was like, okay, how can we find out information on which German unit is opposing the 7th Infantry at any given time? And do they really have any records? The answer in the vast majority of cases is it's hard to glean that out. And if they do, they don't really have much in the way of records. Problem number 2, and I think this is a testimony to the regimental effectiveness, how many of the Germans who opposed them really ended up surviving, or surviving in such a way that they were still accessible as historical sources all these many years later? And again, you're talking about a very, very small group there. So then what you're getting instead is the view of the Germans through the GI's
Hey, Dermot.
And of course, that's obviously that, bird of command, you are the GI. So of course, inevitably you're going to have that. And yes, in my book, certainly it's written from the perspective of the 7th, with the hope and understanding that we can get a broader perspective too, in really understanding where they are, which battle any given time, which part of the world. And the book doesn't just cover World War II. I mean, the regiment has a long history. So each situation they're in varies as to who they're opposing and whatnot. And so my hope always was to get a little bit of read on the enemy, certainly through the eyes of the soldiers, of anybody who they're encountering, usually in the form of POWs, but also, for World War II, later in the war, once they enter Germany. And that's a really interesting dynamic, because many of them have sympathy for the Germans, for the average civilians who are just, caught up in this mess like anybody else. And then many of them don't. They blame these folks, and a few of the 7th Infantry did not liberate Dachau, but many of them were close enough that they could go and see it. And of course, when some did, and they jumped ahead of the view of, I really know what we're fighting for now or against, and all the Germans are responsible for this, and they say they deny it, and so that was obviously the prevalent GI point of view. So you kind of see that wired in the history. You see it a little bit, a tiny ticky tack in the game, a little bit too, but it's not a Holocaust game, But so. I mean, it's such a challenge, I really admire historians who can really dig down and present both sides fairly. I think it's always a challenge, no matter what war, because that's the nature of war.
Yes.
Well, we could do some more clips. We've got some fantastic questions in that I didn't go into this knowing what kind of questions we'd get, because it's, as we said, there being a bit of a crossover, but there are some great ones. And so,
I like big questions.
First one from Susan
down.
Do many women play, and do you see a difference, Luke, in how they play it? Now, the Hank is in the sidebar, and he says you have had some women involved in the gameplay. I mean, it would be, we don't want to kind of make the statement that there's a male way of thinking and a female way of thinking, but do they play, and is there a difference?
Now, if I were smart, I would just stay away from this question probably. But I am going to be somewhat cautious. But yes, we've had some female playtesters. I don't know that we have had enough sample to characterize differences. But what I would say, I remember, just as an example, one of the female players we had she was remarkably aggressive. It was very interesting, which isn't maybe some would support earlier stereotypes. Here I go getting myself in trouble. But I remember there's a Sicilian landing, and she really screwed up our scenario because she just didn't do what we expected her to do, and she took off in this direction and sort of just messed up the scenario. So we had to later redesign that a little bit because we weren't expecting that level of aggression. But I would say the most important thing is individual differences. I'll quote my wife for a moment. I think, and she's actually a vet, Air Force vet, and one of my sons, she says, who are we? We likely think we're a unique and independent individual, but really we're probably something like 25% our family upbringing, 25% our culture upbringing, 25% maybe who we are biologically, and then 25% personal experiences and gender somewhere in there, right? And all these things influence you. And so each of us is extremely complex. So my deeper answer, which I will defend, is back to what I said earlier. Each person is remarkably different.
Yeah.
And how they'll handle the situation is going to unfold differently until you recognize it as a leader. You're not an effective leader. That's the one thing I say, right? That when I became a better leader, the only thing I could generalize was treat each person, it's an ambition, who they are. This would be a really weird analogy. Last night we were watching the one about Mr. Rogers, the movie on Mr. Rogers. And he just trained himself, apparently, to really focus on each individual he was dealing with. And obviously he was extremely effective emotionally. I never ever thought I would bring Mr. Rogers in to a World War II.
We love complete random references.
I win random. Random.
At least he didn't claim he was a Navy SEAL and wore the sweaters to cover up his tattoos.
So I'll do a couple more questions. So, quick one. Well, I think it's going to be a quick one. I'd like you to try and address it quite quickly. One of the if there is a single subject that comes up more than anything else on this channel in the ridiculous 1,700 shows I've done here, is logistics. Wanting more of something you can't get more of. So Scott Grimwood, former Marine, says, Navy, how can the historical issues of logistics be added to a game like this to enhance understanding of this important aspect of warfare? So, as we know, John, liking logistics is in fact very sexy, and understanding how supplies are. How do you put logistics into a game, Luke?
All right. First, Scott, thank you for your service. Secondly, the logistics. What's the great quote? You know, armchair generals talk tactics and real generals talk logistics. And when you go out there, you see like the desert warfare, right? In Rama, I mean, God, it's probably more determined by how much oil they got than anything else. Anyway, yeah. So the tension here is our goal was to reach a broader audience with the game. Right, rather than the military geeks who want to, or the war gamers who I like those kind of things, but we wanted to broaden it. Right, Band of Brothers broadened the audience, and by the way, Susan, I meant to say one of the interesting things about Band of Brothers, because it was the human face of war, it got very strong. It had a lot of success with women.
Oh, you should see the numbers on the tours when Matthew Leach on the World War II Museum. Huge, sort of 60% women. They really? Yeah, it is extraordinary how that has it hit a chord.
That human face of war. Our goal was that human face of war, right? Because war is human. Maybe the drones are going to change that, but right now it's human. So how do we do logistics? We deliberately did not put mechanics in mostly, but then I get to wave the magic wand of the interactive fiction again, right? So if I wanted to, we could drop aliens, through fiction there, and now you have to interact with tentacle Cthulhu creatures, but obviously we don't. You don't. By the way, but we do logistics, of which the example was the Casablanca one, right? You don't have enough supply coming in, which was true, and therefore you're less combat effective. Also, we can do decisions where you make choices, like do you want to get, you have a choice. You could spend your sort of leadership effort and working the higher ups for more, maybe you can get some armor support for the situation, but maybe you want recon. But maybe you want more logistics and ammo, which will pump, the morale up the unit. So we do a lot of that. We have such flexibility to bring in all kinds of factors through these sort of choose your own adventure aspects. But it's incredibly important. Anybody cares about that kind of game, there's a brilliant, not too hard game called Unity of Command. And it's a war game, but it focuses the very clean design on the impact of logistics on how you're going to fight well. If you get ahead of the supply line, if you don't get the railroads repaired, etc. It's quite brilliant there, and it was still unbelievably hugely popular. So,
well, we're going to do one last question. That was a great response, Luke. For each of you, same question, and it is from David. Luke and John, what changes do you hope to elicit in your players? So we've talked, John, about the hope that they will understand the history, delve more by your book and by the books of our friends on the Italian campaign, the Colmar campaign, the South of France. But the changes in your players, that's an interesting one. So it's kind of, John, what's your response?
Yeah, well, I would say, buy my book in this game and your life will be great forever. Obviously, but
I couldn't agree more.
WW2 TV, yes, yeah.
Right, of course, absolutely. But no, I would, what I hope comes out of this from my standpoint, admittedly kind of biased. I'm the 7th Infantry Regiment historian. I hope that 7th Infantry Regiment becomes our base point. We talk a lot about Band of Brothers, and it's incredible. I agree 100%. It's so incredibly educational and all that. I hope that maybe this kind of adds on, and it takes us a little bit to different dimensions, because I think one of the reasons that Luke was attracted to the story of the 7th Infantry Regiment, it wasn't a specialized airborne unit or a ranger unit or a marine unit or whatever. It was a regular infantry unit. And in that sense, maybe a little bit more of a microcosm on some level, although I would argue, too, that it was a unit of such quality that it's certainly much better than most infantry regiment in the U.S. Armed Forces at that time. But nonetheless, I'm hoping maybe that as you play this game and maybe read the book or whatever, that maybe the 7th Infantry Regiment story becomes your base point for understanding a lot about World War II history on and especially on the combat side of the house, right? I mean, that's maybe that's my that's how I hope players will change, is that they're a bit edified more, and that this becomes maybe a little bit of their historical base point going forward.
Admirable bias. I second that.
We wouldn't have expected anything else. I mean, it's an admirable bias. That's a very good way of saying it. But Luke, I mean, obviously you want people to enjoy the game and get something out of it in a pure, simple kind of video, which I'm sure they will. But on a wider level.
All right. So I'll say, short one is yes. Game's goal is not to be fun. Game's goal is to be engaging. That doesn't mean we're doomed. So there's a game called This War of Mine, was successful at the millions of copies level, and it did something very unorthodox. Polish studio covered the civilian experience of war. In war, not everyone is a soldier. I think that's the slogan. Essentially a fictionalized Sarajevo. Oh, good point, Susan. Yeah, again, that'd be fun to respond to. Anyway, they conveyed something different, a connection to the experience. So I've said connection. I've said, I want to say one last thing in the history. And I think you said it, Paul, humility. So my father worked me over to understand that the world's complex, right? And he tried to teach them in the history of technology that, what's going on we see in our politics and technology, very complicated. It's not easy to fix the problems we face in the modern world, yet we all want simple solutions. And when we sit down and we look at people in history, we judge. Oh, you moron. Oh, why did you do that? Oh, I wouldn't have done that. Well, one thing I hope we get in Burden is when you're in there, as Steve Overton, one of our snares liners, along with Hank, says, our job is to put you in their boots on their ground, and then you have to decide. And that teaches humility fast. Because suddenly it doesn't seem so stupid and what they did. And so you're thinking, well, maybe I too should withdraw, right? And I never would have thought I'd withdraw. Or maybe I'm not the person I thought I was, right? So some humility, some introspection, and some compassion and connection to others. That's what I hope for.
Brilliant response. So to just close off then, Luke, remind people, so the game is, people have been pre-playing it and there's clips they can watch on YouTube, but for the release information for the general gaming public, what's the news on how they can get it, when it's coming out, et cetera, et cetera? Do the salesmanship.
Paul, I love you. So first, because I'm a good guy, John owe me later. His book's coming out, reprint, April 25th. The book that inspired the game. Okay, I want to cut now. The game, April 8th, coming out. So, oh my God, a week. What am I doing here? I should be fixing that bug. So April 8th. And I would say also, and come to our, we have Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. I would encourage, like I think it was Gary, people who are not gamers, but interested in what might be going on here. There are a lot of YouTubers putting videos out there, and you can go see the experience. One I like particularly, Historical Gamer is going to owe me soon. Naming him again. He has one called D-Day Morocco or something, and it's very succinct, tight, heavily burdened a command scenario, and you could see more of what we showed you there. And you'll see some of the non-battlefield things like, well, I'll stop. But April 8th, 10 a.m. If you want to help the game gamers, buy it right at the time, because the Steam algorithm where we sell, it pays attention how many people are writing or buying, and we're tiny. And last thing for context for everybody here, 18,000 games came out last year's on Steam. I kid you not.
Wow.
Now, 2,000 to 3,000 are probably the more serious ones, but 18,000. I wonder if it's hard to get attention in that environment. We're little. Paul's give us an opportunity to get some attention here. We have no big marketing budget. I'm the marketing budget, right? So you want to help us. You want us to do more campaigns. You want us to cover other nationalities. We think we can go from like 1918-ish to Vietnam War. We'd love to, but we have to succeed. And tell people, please. I know this is naked marketing for me, but this is truth.
Well, you've actually convinced me to give it a go. I do have a Steam account. I have dabbled in a couple of things. That's it. You've won me over. The two of you. I'm going to have a little look at it and there. So, Luke, John, it's been great talking to you.
Pleasure.
And this is another classic World War II TV show, and it's given me things to think about. I went into this with sort of sort of fairly slowly understanding what's going on, but now I'm going away questioning again things and how does it work. And but that's good. That's good when I get these things. And Mia is saying great discussion. So you're on next month, Mia, talking about the Rangers, what they did. So brilliant, John. Thank you, Luke. I will see you all again. This is Paul Woodadge, World War II TV, saying enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, everybody. Bye.